Hello, hello. Welcome to the Takedown. I'm your host, Nick Nowlin, and here we're subverting power, radical thought. I have with us a special guest, Thomas Shapiro. I want you to say hello to the audience, Thomas, or Professor.
Hello, everybody. It's Tom Shapiro. Great to be here.
Thank you, thank you. I'm glad that you decided to spend this time with us and to talk about some of these things, that we have to talk about today. And I think for the last couple of episodes or some of our last conversations, I've been increasingly finding myself more in a racialized politics niche, and I think it's because in the common discourse that we see going on the left, there's a almost blatant refusal to deal with America as a racialized hierarchy, and I'm not sure if it's conscious or intentional. I just think it's turning out that way because of America is the way that it is. And so I think we need to start bringing this information to light and having people really understand why, something like a universal policy may not be the best prescription towards reaching some of the goals that we're trying to reach. And that's why I really lean on a lot of your work in trying to get leftists in particular, and even neoliberals, to really kind of understand the race question.
Well, that's great. I really appreciate that. You know, I I teach in a school of social policy. I'm a sociologist by discipline, and it didn't take me long to come around to understand that if race is not at the center of understanding why challenges and social issues exist, and if race is not at the center of a policy or social movement solution, we really haven't got to fixing the problem. So race has got to be centered. So part of my project has been to really work with, if you will, the intersection between economic inequality and racial justice. And in the I know we don't want to get too deep into the latest book, but Toxic Inequality, actually one of the animating foundations for me to do that book was to bring those two together, was to show that economic inequality and racial justice, you can't say one without the other. You can't have one analysis without the other. Otherwise, you're really missing the entire picture.
Yeah, and I think one of the primary problems I have with a lot of the discourse sometimes is that it seems like we talk about social policy and like this like how the social hierarchy or the social problems that we have are kind of immutable, like they're just kind of fixed and we're not really making progress, or that we've arrived somewhere we really haven't because they're not making progress there, and we make it seem like it's because these things are immutable and they can't be fixed. And it's like, no, 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 no. You're attacking it at the wrong end. Like, social change is great, but at the same time, you know, a lot of a lot of things that we find in like our social relations to one another and society as a whole is a lot of times influenced by the economic structures that we live throughout our lives, that the economic structures and institutions that are in our society that kind of structure life in a certain way, and it kind of produces, these outcomes. And I think that when you look at it from the social aspect only, and you're not kind of following like the dollars, you kind of get lost in that. And I think that
Mhm.
that's really like that my biggest critique with like with I would say a racial neoliberalism is because it kind of focuses way too much on the social and doesn't talk about dollars and doesn't talk about policy. What would you say about that?
Mm. I think that's spot on in so many ways. Let me say a word or two about universalism first, and then I would really love to backtrack and talk about the wealth in particular.
Hmm.
Um, I've been in the many hats that I wear. My advocacy hat and political hat has me working with a lot of local and national advocacy organizations and community organizers and community groups. And I would say for the last decade or decade and a half, one of the biggest challenges, if not struggles, has been around getting people to see that a so-called universal solution um, is one that really doesn't solve the problem you're trying to get at, and to get people to begin to understand who's left out when you talk about universalism. So I won't name the organization or two in particular, but I think because of what's sort of constructed and ingrained about the American dream and the American ideology, really fits into that universal mode, that you want to lift all of those, rising tide, the universalism lifts everybody. Well, it doesn't. Um, Poverty is not the same if you're African American, Hispanic, or white. And it's not the same because incomes might look somewhat similar, but the level of financial assets, the wealth, if you will, that whites in poverty have is not much at all. In fact, it's extremely scanty, but it is still provides a lot more coverage for emergencies than what African American and Hispanic folks in poverty have. So when Melvin Oliver and I, the co-author on Black Wealth, White Wealth, when we first got into thinking about what wealth meant in American society, I've got to tell you that of the 2, 3, 4 anchors for us, one of those anchors was about the way in which we had only understood poverty, only understood social mobility, only understood work in terms of income. So prior to some of our work, when someone was asked, well, what's the financial equity or disequity between whites and blacks in American society, the standard yardstick was to look at the median income of an African American family and the median income of a white family, and you kind of came up with a ratio, depending on the year, somewhere between 54 cents on a dollar to 59 or 60 cents on a dollar. And that was like standard for decades. And it was like the only measure we used. And it told us a lot. It tells us a lot. I don't want to totally debunk it. But what Melvin and I got to was, what does income tell us? It tells us something important about contemporary institutional arrangements and the power or lack thereof of labor. It doesn't tell us anything about history. It doesn't tell us anything about what went on in the previous generation. It doesn't tell us anything about who was excluded from the Homestead Acts. It doesn't tell us anything about who was excluded from buying a home. It doesn't tell us anything about where people could live in the United States and the history of that. And we had the probably naive idea or aspirational idea that wealth, because it can be passed along in families and is passed along in families, can actually open up a window to the past and can start to bring the history of race and the history of exclusion into the contemporary conversation about racial injustice and economic inequality in the United States. And that was one of the strong foundations of us, Melvin and I, even getting into doing analysis about what's family wealth all about. And so that's really where a lot of this starts from. We could talk about some of the other anchors, but let's stay there for a moment.
I want to ask you a quick question because we're using the word wealth, and you're talking about the transition from understanding things in terms of income, which is like a snapshot, like an instance in time rather than a continuum, right? I want to ask you: did you have like a transitory step? Did you have like a step where I used to think that income was like a snapshot? This is the problem that's happening right now, and wealth is like the result of accumulated income inequality over years, expressed like, income is more like a flow and then wealth being the stock.
Exactly.
Did you make the next step where you're like, actually, I heard someone else say it's actually that it's not that income and wealth are related in that way, that wealth is like a even bigger deal than it is more like an accumulated income effect?
Yeah, I think that's right. So just quickly, we think income is what people get for the paid work they do, or the substitute for not being able to work.
Mm-hmm.
Wealth is more of a storehouse of accumulated financial resources: stocks, bonds, equity in a home, gold rings, whatever it is that can be sold. And that's what American families use to get ahead. That's what American families use for emergency purposes. So for us, one of the other anchors is that um, it's not, sort of ironically, I guess, if not tragically, it's not until the mid 1980s in the United States that we have publicly available data information about the wealth, the assets of American families. The first surveys about it, where it's included in surveys, don't start until 1984. So the political and the social science neglect of wealth is partly theoretical and partly a lack of data. So when Melvin Oliver and I had the opportunity to begin to analyze what family wealth was about, it just, in our minds, was going to open up so many different things. And that's, we were almost working alone on this, and going back and forth. There was no literature about it yet. So for us, it wasn't really a midway point. It was more, it became available for the first time. And,
Ah,
and we understood naively, we understood that it had all these potential aspects to it that social sciences and the left in particular had been amnesiac about for so long. Now, the other part of that, and this, the Black Wealth, White Wealth comes out in 1995. So we start working on this years before that. But Melvin and I are also thinking really hard about the affirmative action debate, and I'll call it a debate in the United States. And we felt then that the affirmative action contentious debate was really much more of a philosophical debate, much more of a political debate. There was no evidence people could bring about what's the impact of the past on the present. Right? We basically had one side that said, well, the past was, maybe it was horrible. We'll admit to that, but it has no bearing on what people individually do today. And the other side, of course, saying, well, the past is prologue. The past has, sets different starting lines. It sets all kinds of things. So looking at family wealth, we felt would again crack open that window to the past that might tell us something about affirmative action, that the past really does matter. Now, what people do about it, affirmative action is not our particular solution, but it really brought evidence to bear for the first time.
and see, what's strange about this is like I also remember that I was very young at that time, but when I read back, some of the arguments made at the time about diversity being a worthwhile goal, as like an institution, we should seek diversity, and these things are better for the students and better for the institution as a whole. I was like, this sort of moves away from the original intent, the historical intent of things like affirmative action, and we're specifically talking to groups of people that were denied access to certain resources, that denied the ability to access certain things in America at particular times in America. That there's a historical reason for why that's put in place, and that kind of gets lost when you start making a universal diversity narrative. And just being honest about it, just to add the little flair and spin on this, not to denigrate any group or anything like that. What I would say is that there are incredibly diverse places that are totally devoid of Black people. So, diversity can be diverse. You could be diverse in one way and then also be, 100% in line with America's racist past in another. And so, like, I think that we have to kind of keep that in mind when we kind of take on these narratives. Oh, I'm sorry, Professor. Are you still there? Professor, can you hear me?
I think he was lagging a little bit momentarily before just a second before this, but it looks like he might have frozen.
Okay, so it seems our guest has had a connection issue. He may have frozen out of time there, but when I talk about affirmative action, and I really just want to be clear, like one of the important reasons for that law, and I just said that, is to kind of begin to make amends for a group of people that were restricted and neglected in some way, and like to try to help them integrate into society. And so when you had that policy put in place in the 60s, in the late 60s, you know, it was only in place for a very short period of time. And of course, by the time the 80s roll around, there's a huge backlash. And like I spoke to somebody about this, how, you know, the wealth gap between whites and blacks in particular closed as you approach the 80s. And then right when you kind of get to the 80s, you see a relapse, almost as if like there's a conservative backlash, or and I'm going to say conservative backlash. What I really mean is there's a white backlash. Like it's almost as if society has configured itself to restrict groups to be in their relative positions, and that's a sad state of affairs. And you know, nobody wants to think of themselves as being a part of that, and I understand that, but that's just the reality of collectively America decided that like black people were always going to be, you know, 1/10 or less of your typical white person in terms of wealth or access to resources and things of that nature. And America did that. I as just you know, in the interest or under the principle of continuity. I guess, you know, the principle of continuity is definitely a big deal to those in governance. I had to listen to a lecture by somebody talking about continuity, and I was like, well, you know, continuity is not always that great. You know, in the interest of continuity, like if a democracy comes and they decide something is unjust, they should just undo it. Like that's my take. There should be no continuity. Like times should change. They should change very rapidly. That means, you know, a society that kind of progresses or you know, kind of like fades backwards, you know. But the point is that these things should happen, you know, fairly quickly, and that's what keeps your society resilient. I think when you have institutions and things that slow things down and make things impossible to change, you kind of get like a stagnation. And I think that's just a debate I've had with somebody that's not pertinent to this conversation. We're really hoping that our guest would come back, because I know he has a lot to say about what I just laid down. I don't know how much he heard. What do you think about that, Richard?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say that I think that there's some interesting aspects being broached here, and some. I think the one of the big points that I think he mentioned was the lack of statistics. This isn't just this isn't a problem unique to this particular problem. He mentions that it wasn't until 1984 that we even started to keep track in any reasonable way of wealth in the country. And I don't know specifically, and I don't know how much his research has overlapped with this, but I do think that there's a significant uptick also during the mid to late 80s and then through the 90s into modern times regarding the proliferation of the celebration of individual wealth, where people were being, you know, Forbes magazine became grows during this time. You know, the lavish lifestyle. This is when video and television is really also more ubiquitous. So the imaging, like the imagery of wealth, becomes really popular. You get Robin Leach and Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. You get Cribs. You get, you know, car show. You get all this stuff celebrating and recognizing wealth. And I think that was an animus for the source of a lot of the understanding more of those statistics, rather than an effort to actually understand how wealth across distribution across the country impacts modern society or policy. And so, and I personally think that we see parallels also with something like you know, police killings, in that there's a benefit to a certain group of people by keeping this type of information secluded or reduced to a certain group of people that actually have access or can interpret the information in a way that can shape policy. So those are some of the highlights that came to my mind.
Give me actually I want to come in and actually say something about that. Like, I forgot to mention when I was talking here that it's not that wealth is the accumulated problem of income inequality. It's that wealth is the direct result of government policy that made certain people available. I mean, certain people able to purchase and hold assets that generated value over time, and that has nothing to do with their incomes. And that's why it's almost like wealth is separated from income in a way, but at the same time, wealthy people have the ability to do things that people that do not have. I mean, the people that don't have that kind of resource to basically tap into, they can do things that you cannot, that improve their incomes. So it's like, really what it is, it's like, it's not that income inequality has gone on for so long, now we have wealth inequality like I thought. That's incorrect. That's looking at it in a linear thing. We live in a complex society. What it is, you move into a neighborhood that's all white, that that black people are redlined out of, and like 20 years down the line, there's all this development in that area, and now the house is worth $2 million or $1 million, and you bought it for like $100K, 30 years ago, and now you've got like all this free money. You sell that and pass it down generation to generation or something like that, and like you can tap into that, use that money to pay for people to go to college cash. They don't come out of school with any debt, things like that. Like, those are just like typical examples, and there's some that are even bigger than that. You can have huge windfalls. Like, a developer wants to buy your property, they buy it out for $1 million cash. You paid $100K for it, and you go buy something else, or you use the money to finance a business or whatever you want to do with it. That's just what wealth allows you to do. And you have a whole group of people that just cut out of that, and then you're telling them that we're all and then you say something universal like, we're all the same. Judge not by the color of my skin, but the content of my character. And it's like, that statement outside of historical context just doesn't make any sense. And I'm pretty sure.
Well, just to be fair to Martin, I mean, he was reasonably aware of the context, but how it's used now and sanitized.
Yeah. I was gonna say, and to be fair, when Martin Luther King used that, he also said that it's pretty unfair to tell a bootless man to lift himself up by his own bootstrap. This is. Martin Luther King understood it. He understood it very, very well.
And that's one thing that came on my mind was a really a good example of what you're talking about and how government policy relates towards the building of wealth, as opposed to just the continuation of income inequality, building to wealth inequality. The example that comes to my mind is Seneca Village. And I imagine a lot of people are familiar with what Seneca Village is if they're watching the show. But for those that aren't, Seneca Village was basically a black-owned village in Manhattan, where Central Park now is. And essentially, the village was raised in order to make room for Central Park. And this is an example of how the government comes in and essentially strips that wealth out of the black community. They weren't fairly compensated, and if you look at what that property value is now, had they not just been stripped out of it, but had been compensated fairly, or had been able to maintain that ownership instead of having their village traded for a park, had they done that, the value of it now is tens of millions. And it looks like our guest is back. And
I said was I basically cut off where I talked about income not being related to wealth in the way that we generally think. We generally think it's like a linear relationship, and like, one's a stock and the other one, one's a stock and the other one's a flow. And I was sort of like, it's actually not quite like that, because some people's wealth has nothing to do with their income at all. It has something directly to do with government policy that gave them access to particular things at a particular point in time, that kind of generate a lot of wealth that they can then use to augment their income or create income generating opportunities. Or sometimes the asset itself is income generating.
Absolutely. So we could talk about a whole number of historical examples. Let me just, if you don't mind, let me go with one of the more recent ones, so we don't have to tax our historical memories too much here, because it also gets at the so-called universal question. Social Security Act passed, I believe, in 1934, 1935, and it's the general belief that it was going to provide a modicum, not the only source, but a modicum of economic security in one's senior years based on how long you had worked. It's a work-based Social Security system. And the general belief is that it covered all workers. Well, the fact of the matter is that when the Social Security Act was passed, it written into the law was not something that said it's only for whites. It's not something that said African Americans and Hispanics are excluded. No, the racialized aspect worked in a very different kind of way, where the law said it enumerated occupations that were not covered under Social Security. And those occupations were agricultural workers, domestic workers, railroad workers, and a few others. Exactly the occupations where African Americans and Hispanic workers were concentrated. So Social Security comes online, and it takes literally until the early 1960s through social movements and reform movements that bring in a larger percentage of the workforce and a larger percentage of workers of color. And so what that means, among other things, is that in one's old age, and if one was injured on the job, if one were the son or daughter of a worker who had deceased at an early age, or the spouse of a worker, chances were that if you were an African American, you didn't have coverage. And if you got coverage later in life, you hadn't qualified for as many quarters, and your monthly payments from Social Security were not nearly as high. Now, that's a totally racialized major social policy in the United States that we don't think of that today. We think of it as, well, Social Security is this great, and I do think it is great, but we often add the adjective a great universal system. Well, today it's relatively universal. There's still occupations that aren't covered, and it's work-based, but we had to struggle. The civil rights movement had to struggle, and the Cesar Chavez and the farm workers had to struggle to bring their workers into that system. And so whatever wealth those families had that were excluded, they were dependent on that in their older age to a much larger extent than workers than mainly white workers.
And let's be clear, it almost turns into a sort of extra burden that's carried that other groups may not necessarily carry. Like if you were in a group that was excluded from that act, that means if, when you were too old to work, you had to depend upon, your family to basically sustain you basically. And this is something where many other families that were included in the Social Security Act, they were able to still remain independent for the large part, by and large, and they were able to not have to add burden on the next generation, having to take care of an older individual of the family. So that's just something that kind of, hey, the next generation's burden taking care of the old, whereas you have a whole other group that's not even bothered with that. In fact, their elderly are able to largely fend for themselves and pass down things rather than using up whatever they accumulated over their life, just trying to survive. And that's a huge issue.
Yeah. The whole process works exactly like that in kind of an unvirtuous cycle.
Yeah, and I think I talked about this on another show with someone else. I want to run it by you just to see what you think about it. But I was like, I would call that a universal policy that was racially conscious, but just racially conscious in a negative way.
That's absolutely right. So there's a lot of conversations we can have about that. One of the historical facts is that the NAACP at the time where the legislation was being considered testified before Congress that it was consciously excluding a large percentage of African American workers in the United States. So it was not as if this was, oh, gee, by the way, it happened to turn out to be the case that no. The fact of the matter is that it was up front. People who had ears to listen to the testimony, who had eyes to read about it, knew it. And certainly the historical interpretations differ a little bit. One interpretation is that the Southern Democrats at the time, that exclusion of domestic and agricultural workers was the price that they extracted from Roosevelt to have Social Security passed.
Well, I mean, remember their primary goal, as another person that I like to read says, sometimes in the South, I'm living in the South myself, there's a tendency towards preserving the Southern way of life whatever that may mean. Generally, when I hear that, or I start hearing about Southern tradition and they start talking about that, I kind of roll my eyes. I'm still quiet. I don't say anything. I don't want to rock the boat. But generally speaking, I remember that means that I'm, people who are just like me, and, people who share, being racialized in the way that I'm racialized. That means that I'm always going to be cut out or burdened in some way or encumbered in some way, because that's preserving the traditions of the South. And there's a lot of continuity. Like when you talk about governance, continuity is a big thing. You want things to remain relatively stable. You don't want things, upheaval every 5 or so years. One of the things that keeps America fairly contiguous is going to be, sad to say, racialized hierarchy and keeping racialized groups relatively oppressed. And also, I forgot to mention while you were gone there, I sort of mentioned that, like, when you were talking about affirmative action before you left, I was like, once you see a policy like affirmative action get in place and you start to see a reduction in racialized inequality, it seems like right around the late 70s, you start to see a backlash at the same time, almost as if society has grown accustomed in certain ways to people being in their same relative positions. And you see like a reversal in trend, and you see kind of like it kind of goes back to the way it was. And now I would even say even going below where it was during the 60s.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on in so many ways. Post World War II to the late 1960s, early 1970s in the United States was an incredible time of both economic growth and economic prosperity, of which virtually all groups shared in, not equally, but the standard of living rose for any group you could talk about from the end of World War II. Now, inequality also got a little bit worse at the same time. So there's both the absolute measure and there's the relative measure. But that closes off in the early 1970s. And that's when I, in my view, the importance of power, order, status politics, wanting to move back to an older era, that becomes much more politically palatable for some groups in the United States who feel challenged, that their status is challenged, at the same time that their economic livelihood starts to stagnate or stall, and they start to everybody has to start running in place. From the early 1970s up until today, I would argue strongly.
And see, like I'm looking at it. I agree with you. Everybody talks about this period. You hear everybody saying, "Oh, the Milton Friedmans, they were just waiting for their chance," and then like you get the oil crisis and you get inflation, and then all of a sudden that gives them the open season basically to crush worker power and to bring it to halt. But I also think that there's a social aspect there, in that when you have an expanded welfare state, it's been shown that generally speaking, having that state is only good so long as it's not perceived as helping oppressed groups. And I think that that's just an unfortunate state of affairs, that we're still kind of there. But I think at the same time, even though it's a sad and it's an ugly history, we need to be adult enough to actually look at that history and understand that that's what it is. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think when you kind of adopt like a social policy only, like a we have arrived and we've overcame kind of politics, or that like, hey, only voter suppression is important and everything else is not important, or everything starts and ends with the prison industrial complex, you're missing out on the whole picture. You're just missing out.
Yeah. Well, I think you're also missing out in, if we want to talk quickly about prison industrial complex or school to prison pipeline, however we want to frame it, that there's a whole history, there's a whole context of that. That I think goes back into some of the history and some of the exclusions and racialized policy that we've started to lift up here. It's not something that just started with, the difference between crack and powder cocaine. It goes back, goes back much deeper than that.
Oh, it is. I wanted to say long and deep, but that sounds horrible. So,
but it goes back to the way in which we have in the United States always used the criminal justice system to mark off citizenship. It goes back to immigration laws. It goes back to marijuana laws in the 30s. You know, why is marijuana classified, still is, as a Category 1 drug? The framing of it is different in different parts of the country, but the strongest part is in the South and the West, where it is about Mexican Americans. Who are constructed as being marijuana users, and that's the explanation for why they're poor and don't work and are slovenly and all the stereotypes that arise up. So prison and the laws have always been used in the United States, I would suggest, to mark off who are full citizens and who are not.
And that is an interesting thing, because if you have an institution that's doing that, that must mean that, you know, things like citizenship must be a big deal. Like citizenship, it means it means something. So all this talk like neoliberal, like everybody's a global citizen and everybody is a citizen of everywhere, and everybody can kind of be everywhere and do everything. They know better. They know better. And I think adopting that narrative as like a left-wing position has really hurt us. We should be doing better. And like, it's not about, you know, being a nationalist and trying to put America first or something like that. It's really about understanding that citizenship does mean something. And the nation state can both be an oppressive institution, but also an institution of freedom. And so we have to reconcile that. It's like a hammer. It just depends on what you're doing. You can bash somebody's head in with it, or you can use it to build a house.
You can build. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
So I think we've kind of covered, like, at least kind of giving us some sort of landscape. But as far as like looking at it society wide, let's start talking about some of the solutions that people start throwing out there and why they may or may not really be solutions. Like you talked about home ownership, but I think home ownership is an interesting question, because when you look at home ownership, we have to start talking about even if you increase the rate, like you really don't do very much in terms of closing the gap, because there's certain things that are operating inside of that complex environment that create a racial disparity, even outside of just the ownership. The ownership is like getting to the park, but that doesn't mean, you know, you're parking front row. You might be way, way far away from the door.
That's right. So home ownership, I think, is the most complicated in terms of it intersecting with so many different institutional spheres in the United States in terms of thinking about a solution. But before we go to the solution, I think it's really critical to understand that the largest driver of the increase in the racial wealth gap over time in the United States, from when we have the data, is the difference in the equity and wealth that's created through home ownership. So that's the biggest driver when we look at the same set of families over nearly 30 years now.
Let me ask you a question on that.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Did you have another point you wanted to make in that same vein? And I was going to ask a quick question.
Give me another half minute or so, and then let's go back, because maybe I'll trip across your question along the way. Part of the complexity of home ownership has to do with the wealth question. So, for example, you know, the data tell us that first-time home ownership, the age of first-time home ownership for African Americans is 6 years later than it is for first-time home ownership for whites. Now, that's not because whites love home ownership more. It's because their ability to tap into family wealth, their ability to tap into loans or inheritance from family, their ability to have lower student loans to begin with if they have student loans, all of those get wrapped in to understanding why there's a 6-year difference between when African Americans buy the first home compared to whites. So there's a whole lot of things that go in there. And as my good friend Derek Hamilton and Sandy Darity, we like to have this this argument among ourselves, which we don't really like to take public for the most part, except for both of us to make the point. And Derek is right when he says that home ownership is a consequence of wealth. And so, if you're familiar with a regression equation, it goes on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Home ownership is both a cause and a result of wealth. And that's also what makes it complicated to look at. So that's the context for home ownership. And some people are right when they say, well, home ownership as a solution is not one that we should lift up to the top, because it assumes that people have that down payment or that wealth to get into home ownership in the first place. And so we need to throw all of that together.
And what I was going to add about that is, we're still talking about wealth in terms of assets and money, but at the same time, I also like to think of like timing and social capital as also a form of wealth too, and that's something that also has to change, because you see, like, let's say we're increasing the home ownership rate among African Americans or blacks, descendants of slaves, whatever you want to call them, here in America. We also still have the problem where, when black people move into the neighborhood, whites tend to move away, and that lowers the value of the neighborhood, or it stunts the growth of appreciation or the appreciation of the neighborhood in a way. And the same thing, if you get more than a certain percentage of blacks in your school, the school is considered less good, and you get a lot of flight away from those, or they start changing things. They start to recut lines and make a new school and only, exclude the black children and things of that nature. Like there's a complex interaction going on where the absence, or should I say the segregation of black people away from resources or away from white people in white neighborhoods gives them their value. And I think that's something that home ownership alone just won't address.
Hold on to that for a second, and let me get back to it, because what I want to provide the bit of context on is that in some modeling that we did at the institute that I direct, some modeling that we did shows that yes, having African American home ownership close to what the rate for white home ownership does closes the racial wealth gap and creates wealth for African American community, but not nearly as much as if those homes are located in communities that provide a rise in value, where most white home ownership does. So if you ask the question, what closes the racial wealth gap more, and what creates more wealth for people of color? Is it the home ownership rate, or is it the amount of equity because of residential segregation suppresses the equity, and in integrated communities, much less communities of color? The answer is where the home is located. So it's about place. It's about residential segregation. And both the advantage and disadvantage is two sides of the same coin. And I think what you're getting to is absolutely right, in that it's got to be looked at as two sides of the same coin. The advantage is not created without the exclusion of families of color, and the disadvantage is created at the same moment that those families are excluded and put into other communities, or steered to other communities, shall we say, where the value is less, where the schools are not the same quality, where the environment is not the same quality, where the green spaces and parks are not the same quality. That's part of the human and the social capital equation that is tied, I think, to the wealth question. It's about place.
And also, sometimes it's not even so much like the place. Sometimes by nature of being where it is, like, you can create development. And what I mean by that is, it's not like they say, hey, let's move here because this is a great location. Sometimes you have enough social and political capital that you can make a place a great location.
Mm-hmm.
You can create great locations to be wherever you are. And I think that's that has more to do with like how the city is governed, where the development from the government comes in. Like those types of things really add into the equation. And like, I think sometimes when people are talking about home ownership, they just completely ignore that stuff. Like they're just not even looking at it.
Yeah, I think, from my point of view, that's the real progressive stance is one that asks for development in place, is one that helps to create the infrastructure and the community that allows that to happen. Now, I don't know how old you are, Nick, but you look relatively young to me, and you may not have grown up with the Jeffersons on TV like I did.
I've seen the
So,
reruns.
so what the theme song is, we're moving up. How are they doing it? By moving out.
Yes,
They're moving,
and
they're moving up by moving out to a different neighborhood. And that's sort of the American pattern. We don't move up by staying in place. We move up by going to, the next higher, so-called higher community. And
and it's
that's
actually really
that's what we have to
problematic.
change. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
actually really problematic because there's a coworker of mine. I think he was like a director of marketing or something like that. He had a conversation with me at lunch, and of course, me being typical me, I'm apolitical, so I just kind of sit there and kind of go along and get along and all that. And he was telling me that, like, hey, this city council person or that city council person has really been standing in the way of progress because there's development money that we can spend X, Y, and Z. And the first thing I asked him was, well, why are they holding up this money? If you want to develop the city, that sounds great. And he was like, well, they were saying that they don't get development in their district. And I was like, oh, well, isn't that a valid concern? And like, all I did was ask like 2 or 3 questions, and it spawned into this very long, uncomfortable conversation. Like, I was sitting here, I didn't even say anything. I'm just sitting here listening to this guy, and he goes on and on and on. And the bottom line is, at some point there should be some sort of distribution, some kind of equitable distribution of the city's resources in terms of development, such that you don't reproduce disparity with public policy. That's bottom line what you have to do. And I think we forget about that when we start talking about things like individual action, things like agency, or even like meritocratic, whatever. We forget, like, a lot of that stuff is happening around us and we're taking advantage of those things, but that stuff is happening around us, not stuff we're directly controlling, like, at least not individually.
Hmm. Hmm. So that's I think there's a lot of wisdom there. Um, I part of the way of thinking about the racialization of policy is the hard to grab hold of and uh, talk about it in an accessible way, in a way that doesn't overly confront people, so at least they're open to it,
Oh yeah.
is the way in which racialized policy pays off for whites. There is a real gain in race. There's a real gain in residential segregation. There's a real gain in school for whites, for some whites. Some their homes increase in value more by that exclusion.
Yeah, it's almost as if they're incentivized to even though they may not harbor, ill will towards, African Americans, descendants of slaves, Black Americans, whatever you want to call them. I said them, us, excuse me, whatever you want to call us. Even though they may not harbor like innate racial ideas, there's an economic structure in place that incentivizes them to act and perpetuate or reproduce racist outcomes. And I think Eduardo Bonilla Silva has a great book called Racism Without the Racist.
Right.
Oh my goodness, that is a great book, and I would encourage everybody to read it so we can really understand, not just America, but he also gives a fairly good general overview of how it works in Latin America too. And I think that for that reason, we really need to understand, like, America as a racial hierarchy and kind of like how it works. There's a complex interaction between groups where, like, one group's disadvantage can become another group's advantage. And it may not have anything to do with like what somebody has inside their heart. That's an over individualization of a societal problem that's backed up and perpetuated by policy.
Yeah. So one strategy or a set of strategies that I talk about sometimes, and people I run around with talk about, is how do we remove the incentives for acting in racialized ways? How do we remove the incentive of moving to a whiter suburb?
I would guess you would have to have more like an
So,
integrationist policy. Like I think you should do like forced integration. And I know it sounds horrible, but there should be forced integration. There should be carve outs for oppressed groups, and people just got to eat it.
well, that's one approach. We can go from affordable housing in every community. You know, I think there's a lot
That's the only way.
of
Housing
policy
policy.
efficacy in talking about that.
Yeah.
But there's also a way in which I will rhetorically say, because I'm not sure I really believe this, there's a way in which I don't care if somebody moves into a McMansion, but I care if that accesses their kid to a higher quality, better resource set of schools. And I care if the equity they get in return for living in that community is greater than in other communities. That's what I mean by removing the incentives. Have the payoff for the racialized behavior minimized or zeroed out.
And what kind of policy would that be? That I would think forced integration would basically kind of achieve that in a way, and then also expand housing access to everybody, and then have everybody kind of start to share the burden of having an entire group of people to be forced to be an underclass. So I think that can kind of start addressing that in some way. But there's a lot of problems with that approach. There's a lot of resistance. You know, we've seen in New York where, you know, parents were saying the quality of their kids' schooling would go down by having, you know, underprivileged kids also go to the school. And I'm just like, wow, this is very strange. You have like almost like a hoarding of opportunity to themselves, and that opportunity being so great because they're excluding people, and they're unconscious or consciously or unconsciously just doing it, and they don't even realize it, or maybe they do.
I think that some, whether it's conscious or not, people do. So I've used the concept resource hoarding exactly in the way you were just talking about it. People understanding where the resources are, and wanting to keep and create greater advantages for themselves and their community in that way. But I do think, you know, housing justice, affordable housing, and however we get there, an equalized equality around schools and the needs in those schools could remove some of those incentives.
Also, here's the question though, because when we start talking about access to good schooling, things of that nature, we're also kind of leaning on a meritocratic narrative of the United States. Like I think, you know, the America kind of runs first and foremost off of nepotism and preferential treatment. So if we know America runs that way, we shouldn't necessarily assume that just having everybody having equal access to education is going to by itself really change very much in terms of the structure, because it could very well be the case that as oppressed groups gain access to education, that the mode of
The way things are
exclusion,
rewarded.
yeah, the mode of exclusion will change to something else, and it'll always be something that group doesn't have, whether it'll be soft skills, whether it'll be personality, not a good fit. Oh, I don't know,
Yep.
you know, randomization. I knew this guy more, you know, whatever that is, we'll find that these types of hard to quantify things will be used as a reason to perpetuate the same mode of operation as society wide.
Yeah, they're not a fit for our corporation culturally. They're not a good cultural fit for the culture we keep here. Using that, go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. So I think we've seen a transition, if you will, from like in the workplace, from hard skills to so-called hard skills to soft skills, to more informal social ways of differentiating along race. An example I will give, because it's really right up to the moment, is that, and you know, I'm certainly a huge fan of it, so don't misunderstand. In some states like the one I live in, there have been movements to ban the box on employment applications. That is, you cannot ask whether somebody has been convicted of a felony. That no longer is a filter for, at least on a job application. And I think that's a great progressive moment. But we now know that employers and HR folks have moved away from that hard check the box to softer skill ways of understanding whether somebody has been enmeshed in the criminal justice system. So the way of discriminating along felonies, which is highly racialized, has moved to more informal and social ways of doing that. And we're seeing it. So that's we have to sort of, in some ways, think through more strategically the policy reforms that we're interested in,
Yeah.
how to achieve that.
And I think sometimes when we're thinking about it, sometimes we want to go with the more easy solution, like, political feasibility starts to become an issue because you don't want to have a lot of backlash. But I'll be honest with you, like the policies that seem to be put forth that don't tend to have a lot of backlash also don't tend to have very much efficacy.
They don't have much bite.
Yeah, like it seems to me the more backlash you get, that's how you know the policy's working.
That's the adage of, if my enemies are talking loud, I know I'm doing good work.
Yeah, I think that
There's
I'm
truth to that.
sad to say it, but cutouts and set asides are going to be like a sure, well, not necessarily a surefire way, but definitely like a way that I can think of that actually works in some way, shape, or form if structured properly. And also, maybe perhaps expanding the public sector by having like a federal jobs guarantee so that you kind of remove the ability of stigmatized workers to always be outside of, mainstream full-time, benefited work, basically, like with good working conditions, benefits, vacation, paid time off, things like that. If you can figure out a way to get stigmatized communities not to be always in that position, they no longer can be there as a readily exploitable workforce, and then use to, kind of like enforce, enforce,
Sure.
what's the word I'm looking for? To kind of scare other people because they don't want to be you. I think that to discipline the workforce. That's what I'm thinking of, to discipline the workforce and make them be more flexible to, decreasing benefits, decreasing wages, and things of that nature. So definitely expanding the public sector to kind of counteract the highly racialized behavior of the private sector is definitely a way to do it.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. As long as, we then need to get into some details about what the conditions and context of that are.
Of course.
So, it's really got to be a good job with good living wage that's got union or other collective protection. It's got to have retirement benefits. It's got to have sick pay. It's got to have vacation pay. It's got to have all the things, if you will, that make it a quality job. Otherwise, it can function as, if you don't work for me in the private sector and do what I want you to do, yeah, you're going to be employed in the public sector at less pay and you're going to be a lower status. Then it serves that function. So it's the conditions around it that I think are really critical.
Let me ask you a question about that. But we've seen now that, for the most part, public sector employees are already paid less than their private sector counterparts.
Depending on where they are. So, public teachers in some states do a lot better than a public teacher in Arkansas, to take just one little example. And it's where the public sector is also where more workers of color are.
Oh, well, that's gonna, of course, traditionally, like I hate to say it, but traditionally, since again, the private sector doesn't accept or absorb stigmatized workers, the public sector picks up those stigmatized workers, and maybe that could explain some of the pay differential as well. It could also be a part of that very same history. You're very correct on that.
Yeah. The history, there are many sides to that history, and I think part of it, part of the positive side is that it was part of the success of a civil rights and feminist movement to open up, postal worker jobs, for example, which for a period of time were pretty good, and it may be one of the reasons now why so many conservatives and Republicans kind of attack the postal service and want it privatized.
Yeah, I've never understood what their special hatred for the post office was. And like, I wasn't looking at it from a racial lens. I was always looking at it from, they just want to increase the profits of FedEx and UPS.
Well, Yeah,
And it
they could
seems,
they
go
could
ahead.
do that, but it's also about those kind of federal jobs were always historically a port of entree for workers of color. Because you then can deal with rather than the individual employers who could be all over the place, they could like you or not, but it could be a focal point of a social movement, which it was around equal access to jobs. And again, they were fairly decent jobs and a relatively higher proportion than the private sector or union.
And
That's
and
that's
and I want to add to that also, like, people will talk to me and they seem to not really appreciate the full gravity of something like a federal jobs guarantee, because they see it as like kind of what you described the first time, where if you can't get a good private sector job, you just get a shitty public sector job. And I was like, well, the point is that I envision, instead of it even being like the lowest rung on the employment ladder, like I would envision, like, when you actually start your career, you can have a career in public service, that, over years and years of experience, you gain skills and stuff, and you can move up the ladder in public service, and have an infrastructure there that would mirror in some ways like what you would do in a corporate world, right? Like,
absolutely. So
and go
one
ahead.
of the points that again, my I don't know if you had him on, but my friends Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton, who are
I've
prime
had
proponents of federal
dairy
job guarantee.
twice.
One of the points they make is that with a federal job guarantee, you basically then have full employment, and that has the economic effect of providing more potential organizing and collective power for workers, whether they're public or private, because you've removed that reserve army, the unemployed, if you will.
Yeah, I think
And that's important. That's important.
yeah, I've said this many, many times. They say, well, you said the jobs guarantee is like a silver bullet. I was like, no, no, no. It actually sets the stage, the foundation for where the real fight is really going to begin. Because, to be honest with you, we haven't even really started to really struggle against what we're up against in terms of
Mhm.
the political economy of the United States. Not even talking about the race question. We're unable to even deal with, some basic questions about the role of government, self-governance. Like, a lot of people don't even know how to do it. Like, self-governance is a foreign thing to them. And like, I'll even hear, very, 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 very smart individuals tell me silly things like people can't govern themselves. And I'm like, well, no, nobody can do anything you haven't been taught to do. But if you teach somebody to govern themselves, they will govern themselves. Just like you taught somebody to put on their pants or tie their shoes. Like, don't get mad at somebody because they've never been taught to do something that they can't do.
Yeah, we'll get there. We've demonstrated we can do that, I think.
Yes, and I think it's part of the human
Yeah,
condition to always grow and learn and to get better at things, and we just have to put more effort towards that. Now, maybe that means we have to change some of the things that make us comfortable. Maybe that means we have to change the way we think about things, the way we approach problems. But that's what being alive is. That's what being human is. That's what progressing as a society is. And I think that that's a worthwhile goal. And the last thing I want to say is, I know we're kind of up against the time limit here. Is there any other points that you think we kind of didn't really cover? Because we can kind of go in there and try to get a general overview.
we could go forever. I could go forever, just because the chasms and the challenges we're talking about are so profound, but they're so much more important than they are profound. So we really have to dig in. Maybe at I don't know, maybe at some point it's probably unfair towards the end of a conversation to raise the R word, reparations.
Oh, you know what? I feel very, 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 very badly that I just didn't even bring that up. And it's because I don't know if I've internalized something, but like, it's at the top of my list. Like, when I hear somebody talk, particularly like if we're talking about politics or a politician, if they can't voice some sort of reparative justice, I don't like to use the word reparation because it's been branded badly. I want to say reparative justice for those who've suffered historical wrongs that are perpetuated up until today. If they can't speak about that very clearly, I really don't have much support for them. And I would hope that as a block, Black people as a whole would start to adopt this position so that we can kind of force that to be more a part of the left wing conversation. Because I think right now It's just not. And I think that's what's been standing in the way of really gaining that coalition that you need politically to really start getting some of this stuff put forward.
Yeah. Yeah. So we need another hour or 14 hours to really chew into that one. And it would be a great conversation. But one of the things I would just say is that it's the reparations conversation is exactly the conversation that divides the so-called left. I mean, that's exactly the line where most progressives, especially white leftists and progressives, will say, we can't talk about reparations because that's going to divide us. And if we want to get to middle America, we can't go there now. And I've heard that, now for decades. But everything we've talked about and all of my work for the last 3 decades, dare I say, maybe not intentionally, I don't know what's in the back of my mind, deep in my heart, but it builds a case for reparations.
I think so. I think this book, Black Wealth, White Wealth, I throw it up. I use it all the time as like, if I'm trying to radicalize a mind and I'm trying to get somebody to really understand the racialization. I don't know if you guys can see that I had some glare from my screen there, but when I'm trying to get people to really understand that, like, saying that you can't talk about reparations or reparative justice, or you can't do anything about the past, and it's the past is the past and it's just over. That is really why there is no coalition. Like, you're basically a part of like racism without the racists. You're basically on that other side when you toe that line. And so, this book is a really, really good book. I think that when you're talking to leftists and neoliberals alike, introducing them to this book really kind of opens their eyes. This book is right along. It goes right up there with Color of Law. This book is like right along that line with there. Like, it's one of the books I recommend that everybody reads. They can really get a grasp of the subject. And I know you have another book. I also have it here. Toxic Inequality.
The relatively new one. Yeah.
This is the newest one. And I just got it not too long ago. I was reading it on the airplane when I was flying back. But I want to both basically get those books basically plugged on the show so that everybody knows to go pick those up and read them. They are fantastic books. And I want to actually thank you for your work. I think your work is incredibly important, and thank you for having this conversation with us. I hope to do it again and we can talk specifically about reparations.
Yeah, I would love to do that. And, I don't know if this is the right forum or not for it, but, I would love to be, in a real serious conversation with, Sandy and Derek and maybe Coates and some other folks.
Oh yeah.
Because there's a lot to talk about, and it's not open and shut. There's a lot of context, a lot of things that have to be gotten right. I had the opportunity in 2011. I spent 6 months in South Africa, and I went there to understand better the challenges that they were facing in terms of constitutional and legal mandates around wealth and race policies. They're trying to figure out, what was transferable, what wasn't, how the contexts were different. And there's a lot to learn, a lot of things not to repeat from that experience.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in terms of like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that paves the way for a lot of things, and the way Black economic empowerment is done, there are a lot of good models for us to look at.
And I really wish Derek Hamilton would come on the show, man. I'm really interested in how you two have different work, because I remember when I spoke to you, you said there are some differences in how you approach some of the things there. But having this conversation with you, like, I'm finding myself hard pressed to really detect them.
Yeah, well, it gets, with two academics at some level, it gets to, sometimes it's in the details and it's far down the line. But basically, it's just a question of balance. Sandy and Derek tend to put, and rightly so, we're both rightly so, they tend to put more of the balance on the historical past, and I tend to put more of the balance on contemporary institutional pathways to racialized policy. So that's but both parts are important, and the whole has to be brought together. It's a question of who you're dealing with, constituencies, and what your work is.
Okay, so now yeah, when you start talking about that, like, okay, that makes more sense to me than we were talking before. And I was like, what? You guys are saying the same thing. What? What? But I guess, like you said, the devil's in the details. And I want to thank you again for coming, Thomas. We'll go ahead and close
Pleasure.
out the conversation. We'll probably edit the part out where you disappeared for a second and I kind of just rambled. We'll probably edit that out.
I think we could just say I felt insulted and left the room.
Oh, no.
That's always my secret concern every time that happens.
How can you be insulted? Look, I have 3 of your books right here. Obviously, I'm a big fan.
I did have one quick question that I was hoping maybe you might have an answer. Maybe you don't have one on offhand. But you mentioned that the statistics on wealth didn't start coming in until the mid to late 80s. Are there statistics now that you would desire to be able to find, or that you wish were being collected, or were more detailed, or anything like that doesn't exist today, or is minimal at today's standards? Are there statistics out there that would help the work that you guys are doing that aren't being collected?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's also a pretty wonky one for those of us that get excited by data. At least part of a good part of me still does. The issue actually is not that the data doesn't exist, but for the work we do, for example, so like, for example, if you're asking the question, what is the impact on young African Americans of student debt? What's the impact of that on home ownership with them? You have to go to 3 different databases to get, one will give you the information about wealth, one will give you a student loan, and a third one will tell you about home ownership. And the sort of the intellectual question that makes it fun sometimes is how do we put that together? And so when you ask questions, if there's data that are missing, it's really more of putting the individual threads of the string together to make the ball. So that would be the answer.
That's incredibly encouraging to hear, because if one place that I could see a younger generation contributing towards that work beyond the traditional academic part, it would be something like sourcing data and putting data, combining databases in more easily accessible and with user interfaces that are more intuitive. And so that's a really positive sign for me that that's something that could be very helpful.
Yeah, it's very labor intensive, time consuming, and unfortunately sometimes expensive work to do. Nick, if you don't mind, it may be helpful to the audience, that we met through Twitter, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I have not a heavy Twitter presence, but TM Shapiro is where people can find me on Twitter, and
of course.
I try to bring stuff of political interest and edgy political interest on that account all the time. And if it brought us together, maybe it could bring other communities together too.
Let me ask you one quick question. You don't have to necessarily give like a long answer, because I know you're ready to go. But we have universal basic income, and we have the job guarantee. I want to know where you are on that.
Oh, all of the above. No, if we don't think of them as binaries, I don't think there's I could be for either under the right set of conditions. As UBI, universal basic income, stands right now, the way it's being framed, I think is not the way that progressives want to think about it. It's basically being framed, and I'll stereotype a bit, coming out of Silicon Valley as the robots are coming, the robots are coming, the robots are coming, no one is going to have work. We have to figure out what to do. Otherwise, the economy will be so dysfunctional with 4 rich people and everybody else in poverty. So the UBI stuff comes out of, that's one of the framings of it. But on the East Coast and the Midwest, it's about the conditions of work. It's not so much about artificial intelligence or technology. It's about the changing conditions of work that really drive the way I would like to see it framed in. So that's sort of one context. The other is, get down to the design and the details. What are we talking about? $15,000 a year? 10? 50? Are people going to be still eligible for other benefits? What's the interaction with Social Security? There's just a whole host of questions that that have not been, there's no consensus about yet. So it can be a very conservative program. It could be very minimal, or it could be very robust and could, provide for a lot more human dignity. So, I've not cast my lot yet.
Oh,
I'm tipping my toes in both. I think there are very, very few potential transformative solutions. I think reparations is one. I think universal basic income is one. I think federal job guarantee is one. So I don't think we need to choose at the moment. It's a question maybe of which one can get us further, and
and
who the allies would be, and who what kind of arguments would have to be used, and what does that do for us? That's my take.
like everybody that watches my show know, like I'm hardcore against the UBI because I see it as like a Trojan horse. I'm like, oh no, that's just you get everybody stuck on subsistence, and then you can control them because it's just too bad. There's not enough self-determination in that. I think the federal job guarantee that was unionized and the workers have say in how it's implemented and what it's done and stuff like that is a more robust solution.
Yeah. All right. So for one of your next guests, if you've not had her already, get in touch with Ann Price in Oakland.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Ann is a real advocate of UBI from a racial justice and feminist perspective. So I don't know if you're going to buy it, but it's something you and your audience should hear about.
Definitely.
I will definitely take a look at that. Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, I don't want to hold you any longer.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Pleasure. Take care. Bye.